Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Please consider subscribing and check out our Patreon for more. Enjoy the video. The morning sun peeked through the curtains, casting a warm glow across Benjamina's face. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering open as consciousness slowly returned. Stretching languidly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cool hardwood floor. As she stood, a strange sensation swept over her body. Everything felt different. Shuffling to the bathroom, Benjamina flicked on the light and gazed into the mirror. Her jaw dropped. Staring back at her was a face she didn't recognize. Softer features, full lips, long lashes framing wide, startled eyes. She blinked rapidly, her mind reeling. This had to be a dream, a very vivid, very bizarre dream. Benjamina pinched her arm hard, wincing at the sharp pain. Definitely not dreaming then. Her hands roamed over her body, taking in the unfamiliar curves and contours. Panic began to rise in her chest as the reality of the situation sank in. Somehow, impossibly, she had been transformed into a woman overnight. Memories of the previous day came rushing back. The snide remark he'd made to that strange woman on the street, the flash of anger in her eyes, the cryptic words she'd muttered under her breath. At the time, Benjamin had brushed it off as the ramblings of a crazy person. Now he wasn't so sure. Benjamina stumbled back to the bedroom and collapsed onto the bed, her mind spinning. What was she going to do? She couldn't go to work like this. Hell, she couldn't go anywhere like this. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in her throat. Just yesterday, she'd been a man, living her life without a care in the world. Now she was trapped in a body that felt alien to her, facing a reality she never could have imagined. A sharp cramp in her lower abdomen jolted Benjamina out of her spiraling thoughts. She groaned, doubling over as the pain intensified. Staggering to the bathroom, she fumbled for the bottle of Advil in the medicine cabinet, popping 2 pills and swallowing them dry. As the pain slowly subsided, Benjamina caught sight of a small red stain on her pajama pants. Her eyes widened in horror as realization dawned. No. Oh, no. This could not be happening, not on top of everything else. With shaking hands, Benjamina pulled down her pants and stared at the bright red blood spotting her underwear. Her first period. The ultimate symbol of womanhood, the one thing she had always been thankful to avoid as a man. And now here she was, experiencing it firsthand in all its crampy, messy glory. Benjamina sat on the toilet, her head in her hands as tears of frustration welled in her eyes. How was she supposed to deal with this? She had no idea what to do, no frame of reference for the foreign sensations racking her body. A wave of despair washed over her. Was this her life now? Constantly at the mercy of her hormones, bleeding for days on end every month? She thought back to all the times she'd mocked women for their time of the month, rolled his eyes at their complaints of cramps and mood swings. Karma really was real. Now here she was, living the reality she'd always dismissed as exaggeration and hysteria. Benjamina took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She couldn't fall apart, not now. She had to figure out how to navigate this new normal, as daunting as it seemed. First things first, she needed supplies. Pulling up her pants, Benjamina made her way to the living room, grabbing her phone off the coffee table. She hesitated for a moment before typing "how to deal with your first period" into the search bar, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. The results were overwhelming. Endless articles and blog posts filled with advice and tips she'd never had to consider before. Benjamina skimmed through a few pages, her brow furrowed in concentration. Pads seemed to be the general consensus for beginners. She added a variety pack to her online shopping cart, along with some Midol and a heating pad for good measure. Her finger hovered over the place order button, a sense of surreality washing over her. Was this really her life now? Ordering menstrual products and pain meds like it was no big deal? With a sigh, Benjamina hit the button and tossed her phone aside. She flopped back onto the couch, staring up at the ceiling as her mind raced. How long would this last? Was the change permanent, or would she wake up tomorrow back in her old body? And if it was permanent, how was she supposed to live like this? Questions swirled in Benjamina's head, each one more daunting than the last. She had no answers, no game plan, no idea what the future held. All she knew was that everything had changed in the blink of an eye, and she was woefully unprepared to deal with the fallout. Another cramp seized her abdomen, and Benjamina groaned, curling into a ball on the couch. She reached for the remote, flipping on the TV in a desperate attempt to distract herself from the pain and the existential crisis brewing in her mind. Some mindless sitcom filled the screen, the canned laughter grating on her nerves. Benjamina closed her eyes, trying to block out the world and all its complications. Maybe if she just laid here long enough, this would all turn out to be some crazy fever dream and she'd wake up in her own body, his old life restored. But deep down, Benjamina knew that wasn't going to happen. This was her reality now, for better or worse. She had to find a way to adapt, to navigate this strange new world she'd been thrust into without warning or consent. It wouldn't be easy. That much was clear. But Benjamina was nothing if not stubborn. She'd faced challenges before and come out the other side stronger for it. This was just another obstacle to overcome, another hurdle to jump. Benjamina took a deep breath, steeling herself for the journey ahead. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going down without a fight. Benjamin might have been a misogynistic jerk, but Benjamina was determined to be different. She would face this head-on with all the strength and resilience she could muster. With a groan, she heaved herself off the couch and shuffled to the kitchen, rummaging through the cabinets for some tea and a snack. Small comforts, but comforts nonetheless. As she waited for the kettle to boil, Benjamina caught sight of her reflection in the microwave door. The face staring back at her was still unfamiliar, but there was a glimmer of determination in those eyes now. A hint of the fire that had always burned within, regardless of gender or circumstance. Benjamina nodded at her reflection, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She could do this. She would do this. One day at a time, one challenge at a time, starting with surviving her first period and all the joys that entailed. The kettle began to whistle, jolting Benjamina out of her reverie. She poured the steaming water over a chamomile tea bag, inhaling the soothing scent as she carried the mug back to the couch. Settling in, she reached for her phone, opening up a note-taking app. Survival Guide for the Newly Female, she typed at the top of the page, her fingers flying across the screen as ideas began to take shape. Research, preparation, a healthy dose of humor, these would be her weapons in the battle ahead. Benjamina stood in bathroom, razor in hand, staring at the foreign landscape of her body. Smooth, hairless legs seemed like an impossible dream, but the internet had assured her it was a necessary part of embracing her new femininity. She took a deep breath, lathering up with the lavender-scented shaving cream that had arrived in her latest online shopping haul. The first stroke was tentative, the razor gliding over her skin with a strange, ticklish sensation. Benjamina marveled at the trail of smooth skin left in its wake, a stark contrast to the coarse hair that had once covered her legs. She continued, finding a rhythm as she worked her way up her calves and over her knees. As she neared her thighs, Benjamina hesitated. This was uncharted territory, a part of her body she'd never given much thought to as a man. She steeled herself, pushing through the discomfort as she removed the last of the offending hair. Rinsing off the remnants of shaving cream, she ran her hands over her newly smooth legs, a sense of accomplishment washing over her. Next on the agenda was makeup. Benjamina had never been one for cosmetics, scoffing at the women in his life who spent hours in front of the mirror perfecting their appearance. But now, as she stared at the array of products lined up on her vanity, she felt a thrill of excitement. She started with foundation, carefully dotting the liquid onto her face and blending it in with a sponge. Concealer came next, hiding the dark circles that had taken up permanent residence under her eyes since the change. A swipe of blush across her cheekbones, a dusting of eyeshadow on her lids, a coat of mascara to lengthen her lashes. Slowly but surely, Benjamina's face transformed. She stepped back, taking in her handiwork with a critical eye. It wasn't perfect. There were a few smudges here and there, a slight unevenness to her eyeliner, but it was a start. Benjamina felt a surge of pride at her accomplishment, a small victory in the face of overwhelming change. With her makeup in place, Benjamina turned her attention to the pile of dresses draped over her bed. She'd gone a little overboard with her online shopping, ordering everything from casual sundresses to formal gowns in a fit of excitement. Now, faced with the task of actually trying them on, she felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach. She started with a simple blue sundress, slipping it over her head and smoothing the fabric down over her curves. The sensation of the soft cotton against her skin was strange, but not unpleasant. A far cry from the rough denim and scratchy wool she'd favored as a man. Benjamina twirled in front of the mirror, watching the skirt of the dress flare out around her legs. She felt a giddy rush of joy at the sight, a sense of rightness that had been missing since she'd first woken up in this body. Maybe this wasn't so bad after all. As she continued to try on dresses, Benjamina's mind wandered back to her old life. Benjamin had been the quintessential tough guy, all bravado and machismo wrapped up in a 6-foot-tall package. He'd swaggered through life with an air of entitlement, secure in his place at the top of the social hierarchy. Women had been little more than objects to him, playthings to be used and discarded at will. He'd scoffed at their emotions, rolled his eyes at their concerns, dismissed their opinions as trivial and unimportant. The idea of walking a mile in their shoes had never even crossed his mind. But now, as Benjamina struggled to clasp the delicate straps of a satin evening gown, she was starting to understand. The constant pressure to look perfect, the endless array of products and potions promising beauty and youth, the discomfort of restrictive clothing and impractical shoes, it was exhausting. She thought back to all the times she'd mocked her female colleagues for their dedication to their appearance, the hours they spent in front of the mirror each morning. She'd chalked it up to vanity, a superficial obsession with looking good. But now, faced with the reality of living as a woman, Benjamina was starting to see it in a different light. There was power in beauty, a currency that could open doors and smooth the way in a world that was often hostile to women. It was a double-edged sword, to be sure. The same beauty that could be wielded as a weapon could also be used against you, turned into a liability at the drop of a hat. Benjamina thought of all the times Benjamin had used his charm and good looks to get what he wanted, the way he'd flashed a smile and watched women melt before him. It had been a game to him, a way to assert his dominance and stroke his ego. But now, on the receiving end of that same treatment, Benjamina was starting to see the cracks in the facade. She'd lost count of the number of times she'd been catcalled on the street, the leering glances and suggestive comments that made her skin crawl. She'd felt the weight of expectation every time she stepped out the door, the pressure to look and act a certain way in order to be taken seriously. It was a constant balancing act, a tightrope walk between being too much and not enough. Too assertive and you were a bitch, too passive and you were a doormat, too hot and you were asking for it, too frumpy and you were letting yourself go. There was no winning, no way to please everyone all the time. As Benjamina slipped out of the evening gown and back into her comfortable sweats, she felt a newfound respect for the women in her life. The ones who had put up with Benjamin's bullshit for years, who had smiled through gritted teeth as he'd mansplained and patronized and dismissed them at every turn. She thought of her mother, who had worked tirelessly to raise 3 kids on her own after Benjamina's father had walked out. The way she'd juggled multiple jobs and endless responsibilities, always putting her children's needs before her own. Benjamina had never fully appreciated the strength it must have taken, the sheer force of will required to keep going in the face of overwhelming odds. She thought of her sister, who had fought tooth and nail to make it in a male-dominated field, enduring countless instances of harassment and discrimination along the way she'd held her head high and refused to let the bastards grind her down, even as they'd tried their damnedest to break her spirit. and she thought of all the nameless, faceless women she'd encountered over the years, the ones Benjamin had dismissed as silly or frivolous or unimportant. The cashier at the grocery store, the barista at the coffee shop, the receptionist at the doctor's office, all of them fighting their own battles, carrying their own burdens, just trying to make it through another day. Benjamina felt a rush of shame at the memory of Benjamin's behavior, the casual cruelty and callous disregard he'd shown for half the population. It was a bitter pill to swallow, the realization that she'd been part of the problem for so long, contributing to the very system that now sought to oppress her. But with that shame came a newfound sense of purpose, a determination to do better, to be better. Benjamina might not have chosen this path, but she'd be damned if she let it break her. She would face each challenge head-on, learn from her mistakes, and emerge stronger for it, starting with the mountain of beauty products still waiting to be tried. Benjamina eyed the array of lotions and potions, the brightly colored bottles promising everything from clear skin to luscious locks. It was daunting, to be sure. But then again, so was everything else about her new reality. She reached for a bottle of moisturizer, squirting a dollop into her palm and rubbing it between her hands. The scent of lavender and vanilla filled the air as she smoothed the cream over her face, marveling at the way it sank into her skin and left it feeling soft and supple. Next came the hair products, a dizzying array of shampoos and conditioners and styling creams, each one promising to tame her unruly curls and give her the kind of glossy, bouncy locks she'd always envied on other women. Benjamina read the instructions carefully, following each step with a precision that would have made her high school chemistry teacher proud. As she rinsed the suds from her hair, Benjamina caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. Her face was still a bit too angular to be considered traditionally feminine, her jawline a bit too sharp, her brows a bit too heavy. But there was a softness to her features now, a vulnerability that had never been there before. She thought back to the countless times Benjamin had stared at his own reflection, preening and posing like a peacock in heat. He'd been so proud of his chiseled features, his square jaw and broad shoulders, the very epitome of rugged masculinity. But looking at herself now, Benjamina couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. Not for the man she'd been. God knows he'd had his share of flaws and foibles. But for the person she might have been if she'd been born into this body from the start. The girl who had never had to hide her sensitivity, her creativity, her kindness behind a mask of macho posturing. The woman who had been allowed to embrace her femininity without fear of judgment or ridicule. But there was no use dwelling on what might have been. Benjamina was here now, in this moment, in this body. And she was determined to make the most of it. She finished her beauty routine with a spritz of perfume, a light floral scent that made her feel pretty and put together. It was a small thing, but it gave her a boost of confidence as she faced the day ahead. As Benjamina stepped outside, the initial awkwardness and discomfort had faded, replaced by a growing appreciation for the unique joys and challenges of womanhood. She walked down the street with a spring in her step, reveling in the sensation of her sundress swishing around her legs. The warm breeze played with her hair, sending a few stray curls dancing across her face. Benjamina smiled, tucking them back behind her ear with a practiced motion. As she passed by a group of women chatting and laughing outside a cafe, Benjamina felt a pang of longing. She'd never had many close female friends as Benjamin, always keeping women at arm's length unless he wanted something from them. But now, the idea of joining their conversation, of being part of that easy camaraderie, filled her with a sense of excitement. Benjamina took a deep breath and approached the group, a friendly smile on her face. "Hi there," she said, her voice still a bit uncertain but growing stronger with each word. "I'm Benjamina. I'm new in town, and I was wondering if you could recommend a good place to grab a coffee." The women welcomed her warmly, introducing themselves and peppering her with questions about her life. Benjamina found herself opening up in ways she never had before, sharing her hopes and dreams and fears with a group of virtual strangers. As the conversation flowed, Benjamina realized that she felt more at home in this body than she ever had as Benjamin. The constant pressure to perform masculinity, to hide any hint of vulnerability or softness, had been lifted from her shoulders. She could simply be herself in all her complex, messy, beautiful humanity. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out Patreon for a lot more content and early access to YouTube videos.